In the year 1839, St. Dimphna's convent sat beyond the last cobbled road of Hartford, shrouded in the shade of great elm trees whose branches intertwined like a vaulted canopy. The high stone walls surrounding the convent seemed built not only to protect what was inside, but to keep it from ever leaving. To the people of the town, it was a place of order and peace, where discipline met devotion and where young women from distant villages found safety from the chaos of the outside world. Its gardens bloomed in perfect symmetry, its paths were swept clean of a single stray leaf, and its windows gleamed without a smudge, as though even dust understood it had no place here. At the heart of this quiet world was Mother Madeline Rochefort, a woman of striking composure and a voice so measured that every word felt weighed before it left her lips. To outsiders, she was the embodiment of grace, soft-spoken, endlessly patient, and blessed with a smile that seemed to carry the warmth of the divine. She had served as abbess for nearly 2 decades, guiding the lives of the 44 sisters under her care, each of whom had taken the same rare and extreme vow, the vow of lifelong silence. No voice rose above the sound of footsteps on the stone floor. No words broke the stillness of the dining hall, where meals were taken in unbroken quiet, only the faint scrape of spoons against bowls filling the air. Outsiders who were allowed through the gates, merchants, visiting priests, or the occasional mother, spoke of the convent's silence as a kind of holiness that could be felt in the bones. They left with lowered voices, unwilling to disturb the fragile peace they had stepped into. But peace has many faces, and some are only masks. Within the convent, the sisters moved in perfect synchronicity, their days dictated by the tolling of the chapel bell. At dawn, they gathered for prayer, kneeling in rows beneath the high ceiling where beams of light filtered through stained glass, scattering red and gold across their bowed heads. Their work followed, tending the gardens, preparing bread, sewing vestments, all done without a word. The silence was not oppressive at first. It wrapped around the mind like a soft blanket, dulling the edges of thought. But as the hours stretched, as days became months, the absence of sound grew heavy, pressing against the skull until the sisters' own thoughts became too loud to bear. Some learned to live inside that silence. Others learned to hide in it. Mother Madeline was always present but never hurried. She moved through the halls with an unshakable calm, her hands folded neatly, her gaze steady. She seemed to appear wherever discipline faltered, a dropped thread in the sewing room, a moment's pause in the kitchen, her presence enough to make the most distracted sister return to her task without the need for words. She knew every sister's habits, their strengths and their weaknesses, as if she could see the thoughts behind their downcast eyes. The sisters adored her, feared her, and could not name the line between the two. Though the convent's silence appeared unbroken, there were moments, subtle and fleeting, when it was disturbed. At night, after the lamps were extinguished and the building settled into the slow breathing of sleep, a sound could sometimes be heard beneath the stone floors, a faint scraping, rhythmic and deliberate. Those who heard it told themselves it was nothing more than the shifting of old timbers or perhaps the scratching of mice in the walls. No one ever spoke of it, for speaking was forbidden, but the sound lingered in their minds long after it stopped. To the townsfolk, the vow of silence was a mark of purity, proof that the sisters were untouched by the noise and corruption of the world. But the truth was that the vow did more than remove the temptation of idle words. It erased the possibility of confession. Whatever happened within those walls would remain there, locked away not by force but by the very rule that defined their lives. Silence was both a discipline and a prison, and in the hands of someone who understood its weight, it was a weapon. On the rare occasions when a sister left the convent, for illness or to accompany a burial, she returned changed. The light in her eyes seemed dulled, her movements more precise, her gestures tighter. Yet no one asked questions and no one offered answers. It was as though the longer one lived within those walls, the less the outside world mattered until it became nothing more than a distant dream one no longer wished to revisit. From the outside, St. Dimphna's was an island of devotion in a restless world. But within its walls, every gesture, every glance, every measured movement carried a weight that could not be named. Mother Madeline ruled not through fear of punishment, but through the invisible architecture of silence, a structure so complete that even thoughts seemed to tread carefully within it. In that stillness there was room for anything to take root, even the kind of darkness that hides in plain sight, patient enough to wait for decades. And though no one could yet see it, the seeds had already been planted, growing in the shadows beneath the chapel, where no sunlight ever touched. The autumn wind carried the smell of rain and distant wood smoke on the day Margaret Delaney arrived at St. Dimphna's convent. Her journey had taken 2 days from the fishing village where she was born, a place of salt-stained cottages and restless waves. The coach that delivered her rattled away down the narrow road, leaving her before the looming gate where ivy crawled like veins across the stone. She had been told this was a place of spiritual rigor, of quiet sanctity, a place where her restless soul could be disciplined into harmony. As the heavy gates opened inward, she stepped onto the gravel path with a curious mix of relief and unease. The air inside seemed stiller, colder, as though the walls held back not only the world's noise but its warmth. Mother Madeline met her at the entrance, her smile perfectly measured, her eyes holding a softness that somehow invited and appraised in the same moment. She welcomed Margaret with a touch on the shoulder, light yet firm enough to suggest possession, and led her toward the dormitory where the other sisters slept in narrow beds lined like gravestones. Margaret's first hours inside were spent in orientation, being shown the refectory, the chapel, the gardens. The silence was immediate and absolute. No voices greeted her. No whispered conversations broke the air. Not even the rustle of robes was careless. The sisters moved with the precision of clockwork, their faces placid and unreadable, their gazes flickering only in the briefest acknowledgments. Margaret had been prepared for quiet, but this was different. It was not merely the absence of sound, but it was a presence, a pressure that seemed to lean against her from all sides. At meals, she learned to read the subtle signs, the tiniest inclination of a head signaling a dish to be passed, the fleeting glance that granted permission to rise. There was no room for error, no margin for clumsiness. Her first night was restless. The dormitory was a single long room, lit only by the dull orange glow of embers from the stove at its far end. She lay awake, listening to the slow breathing of the other sisters, the creak of the rafters as the wind moved over the roof. Then faintly beneath the bed frame she heard it, a soft scraping, steady and deliberate, as though something were being dragged along stone. It came in intervals. Scrape, pause, scrape. The sound was too faint to identify, yet too intentional to dismiss. She held her breath, listening until it faded into the deeper quiet of the night. When morning came, the sound lingered in her memory like a half-formed question. The days unfolded in an unchanging rhythm. Dawn prayers in the chapel, the bell tolling with a slow gravity that seemed to pull the sisters into their places. Margaret tended to the herb garden, where she was instructed to prune only the plants that Mother Madeline marked with a thin red ribbon. She noticed some herbs she had never seen before. Pale, curling leaves that released a bitter smell when cut, and though she wished to ask their use, the vow forbade it. At the end of each work period, the sisters assembled in the refectory where food was served without ceremony. Bread was dense and dark, soup was thin, and the only sound was the muted clink of spoons. Margaret began to notice the smallest irregularities. One sister's robe was stiff at the hem, as if it had been recently scrubbed of something that had left a deep stain. Another bore a faint scar along the edge of her jaw, the skin drawn tight and pale. The sisters never met her gaze for long, their eyes darting away like startled birds. Mother Madeline moved among them with an ease that was almost tender, placing a hand on a shoulder, adjusting the angle of a bowed head, all with the gentle authority of someone who had shaped their lives so completely they could not imagine another way of being. On the fourth night, the scraping returned. This time, Margaret strained to follow it, slipping from her bed to the cold floor. The sound seemed to come from beneath the chapel, though she could not be certain. She crept to the window, hoping to see something in the courtyard, but it was empty, the cobblestones glistening in the moonlight. When she returned to bed, she found herself listening not only for the scraping, but for the silence between, the way it seemed to listen back. She tried to tell herself that this was simply the adjustment period, that the mind played tricks in new surroundings, but the longer she stayed, the more she felt as though the stillness of the convent was not a natural quiet, but an enforced one. A quiet that existed because something was waiting to be heard only by those who listened too closely. And Margaret, though she tried not to admit it to herself, was beginning to listen. The morning of the veiling came under a low, wet sky, and the sisters moved across the courtyard in a wordless ribbon, their robes whispering against the slick stones as if the building itself were breathing them in. The chapel smelled of wax and incense that tasted faintly metallic on the tongue, a sweetness turned sour by time. Candles burned in tight ranks along the rail, their small flames held in the still air like insects in amber, and above them hung the great painted crucifix whose varnish had cracked into hairline maps that led nowhere. On the altar stood a silver bowl and a slender glass ampule, both catching the light in thin, cold flashes. Mother Madeline entered last, gliding rather than walking, her veil drawn low over her brow, her hands bare and pale, the knuckles smooth from a life that had never been forced. The novices to be veiled knelt in a half-circle, heads bowed, throats lengthened by obedience, and Margaret, permitted to observe as a postulant, stood in the shadows by the pillar and tried to quiet the fast. Hot pulse in her neck. The vow, she had been told, was a surrender of voice to God, a leaving behind of the world's noise so the soul could be heard. But the room felt like a sealed jar, and the only thing she could hear was the scratching of her own doubt. A bell sounded once, soft and close, and the sisters began to hum without melody, a thin current of breath that skimmed along the stone and pooled at the feet of the altar. Mother Madeline lifted the ampule and poured a bitter, brown liquid into the silver bowl. Even from the back, Margaret smelled a rooty sharpness that stung her eyes and cut through the incense. The abbess spoke in a slow, careful tone that floated on the surface of the hum, words about purity and discipline and the promise of a clean mind. And then she dipped a ladle into the bowl and brought it to the first novice's lips. The novice swallowed and shuddered, and a wet tremor passed over her mouth as if her tongue had tried to pull itself away from the taste. The line moved one by one, each novice taking the draught, eyes watering, hands clenching inside sleeves, shoulders tightening, and with each swallow the hum seemed to thin out and stretch until it was little more than the sound of air being pushed through pain. When it was done, Mother Madeline wiped the ladle with a white cloth and set it down with a soft click that carried farther than it should have. The novices sat motionless, the skin along their throats blooming with small, hot patches, and Margaret watched the color climb and fade in slow waves, as if some inward flame were being fanned and then smothered. The abbess opened a cedar chest and drew out the veils. Narrow lengths of black fabric stiffened by tiny, precise stitches. Each had a series of cutouts so clean they looked pressed by a blade made to measure, ovals and crescents that would frame the eyes and mouth and rest along the line of the jaw. Margaret noticed the careful spacing, the way the edge near the mouth cut lay a finger's breadth above where a surgeon might make an incision if he meant to reach a tendon and spare the artery. She did not know why that thought came, only that it arrived complete and cold. Mother Madeline fitted the first veil over the first novice's face, and in that second the girl seemed smaller, as if the fabric had gathered in more than hair and skin. The abbess adjusted the angle with light taps of her fingertips, the manner of someone who understood the limits of flesh. Margaret's eyes moved from veil to veil, seeing how each aperture aligned not just to features but to soft tissue beneath, how the thread knots sat exactly where pressure would bruise most quickly, and how the faint inner lining bore a grayish sheen, as if something had once soaked there and never fully left. One novice blinked hard, and a tear slid into the narrow mouth cut, vanishing under the lower edge. Her eyes held that shine of someone trying to pray past fear and failing. The bitter draft worked quickly, numbing tongue and throat, leaving the girls with the hollow, glassy breathing of patience after the bite of a tonic they did not consent to understand. Mother Madeline raised her palms, and the humming stopped at once, the silence landing with a soft, heavy thud, like snow dropped from a ledge. She leaned close to each veiled face with a tenderness that read as love until one watched her too long. Then it read as measurement, a quiet taking of inventory. She spoke about stillness, about the danger of idle sound, about how a voice can rot the soul from within. And as Margaret listened, she felt the meaning turn on itself, like a key turned not to open a door but to lock it. The abbess circled behind the kneeling half-moon and traced the base of each skull with a slow pass of her thumb, right where the neck meets the hairline, the motion calm and steady as if reminding the body where to obey. Margaret's own throat tightened in answer. She could almost feel the ghost of that touch, the neat, cool line of it. When the last veil was set, Mother Madeline lowered the lid of the cedar chest with care, sealing away the spares, and for a breath the chapel seemed to lean toward the sound like an ear. The bell tolled again, single and exact, and the sisters rose in unison, an angled forest of veils moving toward the rail with the same pace, the same small lift in the step, the same trained quiet that pressed on the lungs. Margaret thought of the scraping beneath the floor at night, the slow stroke against stone, and the neat cuts on the veils looked like cousins to that sound. The procession turned, and the abbess's gaze brushed past Margaret and did not stop. Yet the brush felt like a blade laid flat, the cool weight of a warning. The line flowed out into the corridor, each new silence passing where the light failed, and the last candle guttered with a faint, wet noise that made Margaret's teeth set. By the time she reached the door, the incense had curdled into a taste she could not swallow, and the thought had rooted itself with a clean, merciless point. Here. A voice did not vanish by chance. It vanished by design, and the design had a mind that counted by throats. The scraping had grown louder over the past nights, a patient rhythm beneath the floorboards of the chapel that seemed to start only after the lamps were dimmed and the sisters had retired to their cells. Margaret told herself not to follow it, but the thought grew in her mind like a splinter under skin. Small at first, but impossible to ignore once the flesh around it began to swell. That night the moonlight fell in fractured strips across the corridor stones, the wind pressing its damp hand against the window panes. She waited until the building's quiet deepened into that particular stillness that comes when sleep has taken most but not all, when the air feels thin and brittle. Then she slipped from her cot, moving on bare feet toward the chapel. The air inside was cooler, tinged with the faint mineral dampness of stone that had never seen sun. She stood in the aisle, Letting her eyes adjust, the pews hunched like patient animals on either side. The sound came again. Scrape, pause, scrape from beneath the altar itself. She approached, her breath shallow, and ran her fingers along the carved edge of the altar rail until they found an irregularity. A slight gap where the stone did not meet cleanly. Pressing there released a soft click, followed by the whisper of hinges hidden deep within the frame. A section of the altar's base swung outward just enough for a narrow person to slip through. The scent that met her was wrong, an earthy dampness sharpened by something metallic, something that made her mouth taste of coins. She ducked inside, the space closing around her, the sound of her heartbeat seeming too loud. The passage descended in tight stone steps, the air growing cooler with each turn until she emerged into a low, arched chamber lit by a single oil lamp resting on a shelf. Its glow reached only so far, leaving the edges of the room in thick shadow. At the center stood a long wooden table with wide leather straps affixed at each corner, the wood beneath them stained in irregular dark patches. Beside it was a narrow stool, its legs uneven as if it had been dragged too often across the same patch of floor. On the surrounding walls were shelves lined with glass jars, each filled with a cloudy liquid that distorted the pale, floating shapes within. Some were small enough to fit in the palm, others were longer, twisting in the jar like roots pulled from earth. The sight made Margaret's stomach tighten against her spine. Against one wall hung tools, bone-handled scissors, slender blades with hooked tips, metal probes worn smooth by years of use. None bore rust, though their edges caught the light with a cold gleam. On another shelf, bundles of dried herbs hung from twine, their leaves curled inward as if recoiling from what surrounded them. The air was heavy with the mingled scents of those herbs and something that had once been warm but was now long dead. Margaret stepped closer to the shelves of jars, her hand trembling as she reached for one. The glass was cool against her skin. Inside floated something pinkish white, folded in upon itself, threaded through with fine lines. It took her a moment to recognize it, or to believe she had recognized it. But once she did, she could not unsee it. A preserved tongue. She replaced the jar quickly, her hands slick now, and backed away. Her eyes moved to the table again. The leather straps were too wide for wrists alone. They could bind arms or legs, perhaps both at once. The stains in the wood had soaked deep, the grains swollen where liquid had been left to stand. Above the table hung a narrow shelf holding only a small, hand-bound ledger. She opened it, the pages stiff with age, the ink in a tight, disciplined hand. Each page bore a date, a name, and a short notation, sometimes in Latin, sometimes in French, occasionally only a symbol, a cross, a spiral, a small open circle. She saw names she recognized from the convent's roster, but beside them the dates were not days of arrival or departure. They were too close together. These were not records of life. They were records of something taken. As she turned the last page, a faint shift in the air brushed her cheek. The unmistakable awareness of not being alone. She froze, listening. No footsteps, no breath, just the creak of the lamp's flame bending. Slowly she returned the book to the shelf, her fingers careful not to betray the urgency knotting her chest. The scraping sound came again, but here, in the chamber, it was magnified. A deliberate stroke of metal against stone from somewhere beyond the arc of light. She strained her eyes and thought she saw a shape in the darkness. Tall, unmoving. A deeper black against the black. It did not advance, but neither did it retreat. For a moment she thought she saw the faintest tilt of a head, as if measuring her the way one might measure cloth before cutting. Margaret stepped backward toward the stair, her body angled to keep the shape in her periphery. She moved slowly, afraid that sudden movement might provoke something she could not name. The air seemed to thicken as she reached the first step, her throat tightening as though the room itself disapproved of her leaving. When she finally slipped through the narrow door into the chapel, she pressed the hidden panel closed until the click came, sealing whatever lay beneath once more. She stood in the dark, her palms damp, her pulse roaring in her ears. Above the altar, the crucifix gazed down, its painted eyes catching just enough of the moonlight to seem alive. For the first time since arriving, Margaret wished the vow of silence could be broken, wished for someone to hear the truth and believe it. But here, truth had no voice, and the walls would not repeat it. She returned to her cot with the taste of copper still on her tongue and the quiet certainty that the scraping was not a sound to be ignored. It was an invitation. It happened without warning, without ceremony, as though the absence itself had been rehearsed. At dawn prayers, Sister Anne's space in the chapel was empty. Her folded veil rested on the bench as if she had only stepped away for a moment, but the place where she should have knelt remained vacant through the service. No one looked at it directly, though Margaret felt a subtle shift in the air around her, a kind of pressure that seemed to push everyone's gaze downward. When the bell rang for the morning meal, Mother Madeline announced in her calm, measured tone that Sister Anne had been called to a higher solitude. The words fell into the silence like a pebble into deep water, vanishing without a ripple. No one asked where she had gone, and no explanation was offered. By vespers, Anne's bed was stripped, her few possessions gone as though she had never been there at all. Margaret moved through the day with a tightening in her chest, her eyes drawn to every corner where Anne's presence might once have lingered. She had worked beside her in the garden only 2 days earlier, the two of them kneeling in the damp soil, hands brushing as they reached for the same stalk. Anne had not looked up then, but there had been a quick, almost imperceptible tremor in her hand as she passed Margaret the pruning shears. It seemed impossible that such a solid living moment could dissolve into nothing. That night the scraping came again, louder, longer. Margaret lay awake, listening to the same deliberate rhythm she had heard beneath the chapel. Num-num, scrape, pause, scrape, until it seemed to burrow into the marrow of her bones. She closed her eyes and tried to imagine some harmless cause, but the image that came was of Anne's hands, pale against the dark wood of the garden fence, and the sudden thought of them bound in those leather straps made her stomach knot. The following morning, Margaret noticed something small but impossible to dismiss. In the chapel, just at the edge of the altar rail, a single drop of dried blood had darkened the stone to a near black spot. It was no larger than the head of a pin, but its presence felt heavy, deliberate. She glanced toward the other sisters, but no one seemed to see it. Or perhaps they did and had learned not to look. The day passed in a strange half-light, clouds pressing low over the convent, the air damp enough to make the walls sweat. Tasks were completed with mechanical precision, every movement as exact as the toll of the bells. But something had shifted. Conversations and gestures were briefer, glances more guarded. Margaret sensed that the other sisters were holding themselves more tightly, as if afraid that some unspoken boundary had grown thinner overnight. By the third day, Anne's absence was treated as fact. Her name was not spoken, her duties redistributed without mention. In the refectory, Margaret caught sight of the empty seat where Anne once sat, and for the first time she thought she saw a flicker of emotion pass over one of the sisters' faces. Not grief, not even fear, but something quieter and more dangerous. Resignation. It was the expression of someone who had accepted that such vanishings were not rare but inevitable. That night Margaret's sleep was broken again, but not by scraping. This time it was a soft rhythmic thump, like the beat of a pulse against wood. She sat up, straining to hear, but it stopped as soon as she moved. The air felt heavier than it had before, almost damp in her lungs. She lay back down, but the taste of copper lingered on her tongue, sharp and thin. In the days that followed, the scraping returned, fainter but no less deliberate. Margaret noticed that whenever it began, the sisters seemed to move more quickly to their beds, their eyes avoiding the chapel as they passed it. No one dared be caught in the corridors after dark. Margaret began to wonder if the sound was not a warning, but a summons, that somewhere within the silence, a choice was being made about who would remain and who would be erased. The absence of Anne became part of the convent's silence, folded into its daily rhythm like the steady toll of the bell. To the townsfolk, nothing had changed. They still saw the same perfect order when Mother Madeline led the procession through the courtyard, still believing the convent to be a haven from the world's cruelties. But within the walls, the loss of one sister left a space that could not be filled by prayer or discipline. It was a space that reminded Margaret, every time she looked at it, that here a life could vanish without a trace, without witness, and without the faintest sound. Margaret began to understand that the vow of silence at St. Dymphna's was not simply an act of devotion but a system, one that was both meticulously constructed and brutally enforced. It revealed itself slowly, like a drawing scratched into a wall long ago, visible only when the light fell just right. She noticed first in the refectory, watching the older sisters chew with a measured, almost unnatural rhythm. Their jaws moved stiffly as though the muscles themselves had learned caution. Some swallowed without sound, their throats constricting in the faint jerking motion of those who had lost the easy coordination of speech long ago. The absence of voices was not the still quiet of choice. It was the hollowed quiet of bodies that had been altered. One afternoon, tending the herb garden, Margaret was ordered to prune the pale, curling plants she had seen before, the ones marked by thin red ribbons. Their scent was acrid, almost medicinal, and lingered on her skin no matter how many times she washed her hands. She saw Mother Madeline standing in the courtyard later that day, crushing the dried leaves between her fingers and mixing them into a dark powder. The abbess poured this into the same silver bowl Margaret had seen at the veiling. She realized with a jolt that the bitter draught was not symbolic. It was chemical, crafted to weaken the muscles of the throat over time, softening the chords until even a whisper would be painful to produce. Yet there were those for whom the draught was not enough. Margaret began to piece this together when she saw in the infirmary a wooden tray bearing a folded cloth, bone-handled scissors, and a slender metal probe. The instruments were clean, but the cloth was marked by faint brown stains, washed but never fully gone. She passed the tray in silence, but her eyes caught on the edges of something more. A shallow box pushed half under the cot, its lid cracked enough for her to see a strip of leather with a buckle. Not for binding hands or feet, but for securing the head at the jaw. From then on, she noticed scars. Small, neat lines under the curve of the jaw, pale against the skin. They were too deliberate to be accidents, too uniform to be coincidence. Some sisters bore them faintly, hidden beneath the edge of their veils. Others, especially the older ones, had flesh that seemed drawn tight, the contours of their faces subtly altered. These were the corrected, women whose vows had been reinforced by the removal of what could break them. Late one night, Margaret lay awake, listening to the scraping when she heard another sound layered beneath it, a muffled, strained exhalation. It was almost a sigh, almost a word, but it broke off into silence as if cut by something sharper than breath. The next day, a younger novice failed to appear for work duty. By evening, she was back, but her eyes were swollen, her mouth slack and slightly open, the shape of her lips unfamiliar. She kept her head bowed for the rest of the day, hands pressed together so tightly her knuckles whitened. Margaret's thoughts returned to the chamber beneath the chapel. She imagined the table, the straps, the tools hanging like patient instruments awaiting their turn. She understood now that the jars she had seen were not trophies in the common sense. They were records, physical testimonies to the abbess's philosophy. A removed voice was not destroyed but preserved, its essence kept as a symbol of total obedience. Whether Mother Madeline truly believed she was purifying the soul or whether it was a doctrine she had invented to justify her compulsions, Margaret could not yet decide. But she knew it was methodical, and that method was its own kind of madness. The silence itself became heavier the more she understood it. It was no longer just the absence of speech. It was the constant presence of control, a hand resting lightly but unyieldingly at the back of every neck. Even her own thoughts felt more fragile. She began to measure them before letting them form, as though the abbess might somehow hear their shape. At meals, she found herself matching the chewing rhythms of the others without thinking, her breath falling into their pace, her eyes lowering when Mother Madeline passed. The danger of such control was that it could feel like safety if one stopped resisting. She tried to imagine speaking, not to confess, not to cry for help, but simply to break the spell, and found her throat tightening in protest. Her voice had grown strange in her own mind, an echo of something distant. She realized with a shiver that this was the point, to make the act of speaking feel unnatural even to those who still could. One evening, while cleaning the chapel floor, Margaret saw a faint smear on the stone, almost invisible unless one knelt as she did. It was a rusty brown, worked into the pores of the stone near the altar rail. The grain of it told her it had been wiped quickly, but not completely. Above her, the crucifix loomed, its carved mouth open in silent agony, and she felt the full weight of the place pressing down. Here, silence was not peace. It was a cage built so carefully that even the caged began to guard the bars themselves. Margaret returned to her bed that night with the image of the scars, the taste of bitter herbs still lingering in memory, and the sound, that soft, deliberate scrape, running through her like a second pulse. She knew it now, for what it was, the sound of something being prepared. The discovery began in the library, a narrow, airless room with shelves that smelled of dust and candle soot. Margaret had been sent there to fetch a hymnal, but found herself drawn to the upper shelves where the oldest books sat in uneven stacks. The leather was cracked, the spines brittle, and many were written in a looping old-world script. She pulled down a small dark volume, its cover unmarked, its weight oddly heavy for its size. Inside, the pages were dense with drawings, anatomical sketches, each one focused on the human throat, tongue, and larynx. Some were labeled in Latin, others in French, with precise measurements noted in the margins. The detail was unnerving, the grain of muscle fibers, the branching of tiny blood vessels, the shaded hollows where nerves threaded into flesh. It was not the work of a casual student. This was the hand of someone who had studied the subject with a persistence that went beyond curiosity. Margaret turned the pages slowly, her breath catching as she found sketches of surgical instruments, each numbered and labeled, their purposes described in exacting detail. She recognized the bone-handled scissors from the chamber below the chapel, the narrow hook-shaped blades, the slender probes. Beneath one diagram was a note in French written in a sharp, deliberate hand. Pour extraire la racine de la désobéissance. To extract the root of disobedience. Another section described preservation techniques. The author, almost certainly Mother Madeline, detailed methods for suspending tissue in a mixture of alcohol and certain plant extracts to prevent decay. Small illustrations showed the tissue curled upon itself in jars, the fibers tightening like the petals of a flower left to dry. There were notes about how these preserved voices could be consulted, as though each retained some imprint of the will it once served. The idea was presented without doubt or hesitation, as if it were a truth proven beyond question. Margaret felt her stomach turn as she imagined the abbess in her private quarters, sketching these diagrams by lamplight, her steady hand tracing the lines of a throat not as an artist, but as an engineer perfecting a mechanism. She thought of the jars in the chamber, the pale, twisted shapes floating in their cloudy liquid, each one labeled with a sister's name and date. The journals transformed them in her mind from curiosities into deliberate acts of collection, trophies in a war waged against the human voice. Later that week, Margaret passed by the abbess's quarters and saw the door slightly ajar. Inside, Mother Madeline sat at a desk, her back to the door, working on what appeared to be another drawing. Her movements were unhurried, her pen gliding in clean, exact strokes. On the table beside her was a jar Margaret recognized instantly. The same cloudy liquid, the same pale contents within. The abbess lifted it occasionally, holding it to the light as though consulting it for guidance before returning to her work. Margaret stepped away before she could be seen, her pulse hammering in her ears. She could not decide which was more disturbing: that Mother Madeline believed these severed voices had something to say, or that perhaps in some way beyond understanding, they did. The thought clung to her for days, coloring every moment she saw the abbess pause mid-task, her gaze drifting to some unseen point as if listening for a reply. The other sisters never spoke of the jars or the instruments, but there were small signs that they knew. When the abbess passed, some lowered their eyes too quickly, their hands tightening within their sleeves. A few avoided the chapel entirely after dark, their steps quickening as they neared it. Margaret began to realize that the convent's silence was not a single rule but a layered system of control, each part reinforcing the others. The chemical weakening of the throat, the physical corrections, the preservation of what had been taken, and the belief, whether feigned or sincere, that these preserved parts retained a kind of holiness. One evening, while tending the lamps in the chapel, Margaret noticed faint lines scratched into the underside of the altar rail. They were not random marks, but a series of small spirals, each about the size of a fingertip. She traced one with her nail and felt the shallow groove it left. They matched a symbol she had seen in the journals. A mark beside certain names, always the ones with the most detailed anatomical notes. She wondered if the rail was marked for each voice taken, a tally of obedience enforced. That night the scraping came again, but slower, as if drawn out for effect. She imagined the abbess descending into the chamber, choosing a jar, lifting it to the lamplight, and listening. The image brought a tightening to her chest, an instinctive urge to run that she crushed down into stillness. Here panic was dangerous. It quickened the breath, made the hands tremble, and in this place every tremor was noticed. Margaret lay awake for hours, her mind returning again and again to the sketches, the notes, the preserved remains. The abbess's obsession was not with punishment alone. It was with perfection. She seemed to believe that by removing the physical means of disobedience, she could reshape the soul itself. And worse, she had time. Time to work, to refine, to continue her collection until there were no voices left to take. Margaret knew then that the jars were not relics of past cruelty but promises of future acts, each one waiting for the moment it would no longer be alone. The storm arrived without warning, as if summoned by something deep within the convent walls. The afternoon sky, already heavy with clouds, blackened until the chapel windows were as dark as unlit mirrors. By evening, rain lashed against the panes with a force that made the glass shiver, and wind pressed itself into every gap in the stone, howling through the corridors like a living thing. The lamps guttered in the drafts, their flames bending and shrinking until the light was thin and wavering. By the time the great bell called the sisters to complain, the air was swollen with the metallic scent of lightning, the promise of a downpour that could drown the sound itself. Margaret, unable to sleep, lay in her cot listening to the restless shift of the building. The scraping began again, but tonight it was different. It carried an edge, a quicker, sharper stroke, as though whoever worked below was in a hurry. And beneath it, woven faintly through the noise, came something else. At first she thought it was the wind finding a strange resonance in the stone, a series of faint, breathy notes. But the longer she listened, the more certain she became. These were voices. She slipped from bed, careful not to wake the sister beside her, and crept through the darkened dormitory. The rain had found its way under the doors, pooling in shallow gleams on the floor. Her bare feet moved silently along the cold stone, the sound growing clearer as she neared the chapel. The door was ajar, moving slightly in the wind. Inside, the candles had all been extinguished except for one, left burning on the altar, a single shivering flame that threw the crucifix into fractured shadows. The sound came from below, seeping up through the floor. Dozens of voices layered atop one another in whispers, murmurs, and half-sung phrases. She stepped toward the altar, heart pounding, and pressed her ear to the stone. The cold bit into her skin, but she hardly noticed. The voices were clearer here. They spoke in fragments, some in Latin, some in French, others in a guttural whisper she could not place. Some seemed to be praying, others pleading, and a few were repeating the same word again and again until it lost its shape. It was not the wild babble of madness, but the orderly chaos of many speaking at once, each unaware or unbothered by the others. Margaret knew without question where they came from. The jars, the preserved throats, tongues, and cords she had seen floating in their cloudy prisons. Somehow, impossibly, they were speaking. Not with air, not with breath, but with whatever remained of the will that had once animated them. She imagined the abbess descending into the chamber to consult them, to ask her questions and hear their answers, each voice still bound to obedience even in death. Drawn by something she could not name, Margaret found the hidden panel and slipped inside, the storm's howl muffling behind her as she descended. The chamber was alive with sound now, the jars trembling slightly on their shelves as if vibrating to their own words. The lamplight swayed, casting the contents into shifting relief. Pale coils twisting gently, fine threads of preserved tissue glistening in the flicker. The voices did not rise or fall in volume. They existed in a steady stream as constant as rain, yet she felt each one pulling at her attention, as though choosing her in turn. She stepped closer to one jar marked with a date from years before her arrival. The voice inside was low, almost a sigh, speaking in French words she did not fully understand. But the tone was unmistakable, pleading. She turned to another whose contents floated like a curled fist. The whisper here was faster, urgent, its cadence one of warning. Others spoke in a monotone as if reciting scripture, their voices stripped of all inflection. She realized with a shudder that each voice retained something of its final moment, trapped in the same state in which it had been taken. Then she heard it. A voice that spoke her name, not loudly, not insistently, but with the quiet inevitability of someone reading from a list. It came from a jar on the highest shelf, where the glass was darker, the liquid clouded to opacity. She could not see what floated within, but she felt its attention as surely as if it had turned to face her. The sound was not accompanied by any movement of the liquid, no tremor in the glass. Only the word, repeated once more before falling silent. The other voices continued, unbothered, their layered tones weaving in and out of one another until Margaret's head ached. She stumbled backward, the edge of the table catching her hip, and the jars nearest her rattled in response. For a moment she thought they might fall, and the image of them shattering, their contents spilling into the open air, struck her with an irrational terror. She backed toward the stairs, her eyes locked on the highest shelf, half expecting the jar to speak again. It didn't. When she emerged into the chapel, the storm had reached its height. The wind roared through the cracks, and the last candle on the altar guttered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. The voices below seemed to retreat with the light, fading until only the rain remained. She stood in the dark, listening to the absence, wondering if she had truly heard her name or if the chamber had simply learned how to shape fear into sound. As she made her way back to the dormitory, she felt certain of one thing. The abbess did not keep the voices to honor the past. She kept them because they were still useful. And if they could speak, they could also betray Danun. Not her, but each other. The next morning, the air in the convent felt sharper, as though the storm had scoured away its outer calm and left something raw beneath. Margaret moved through her duties with a gnawing unease, certain that the abbess knew. She could feel it in the way Mother Madeline's gaze lingered on her for a fraction too long during prayers, in the precise arc of her movements as she passed behind her in the refectory. By midday, Margaret was summoned to the infirmary. The summons came without words, only a slight tilt of the abbess's head toward the hallway. But the meaning was clear. Inside, the air smelled faintly of boiled linen and dried herbs. The door shut behind her with a muted thud. Mother Madeline stood by a small iron stove, stirring a pot with deliberate, unhurried strokes. On a nearby table lay a basin of water so hot that faint tendrils of steam curled upward, carrying with them a mineral tang. Without a word, the abbess gestured for Margaret to sit. Her hands were taken and placed into the basin before she could think to resist. The pain was immediate, sharp, blooming, and total. The heat bit into her skin with the relentlessness of something alive, wrapping her fingers and palms in fire. She tried to pull back, but the abbess's grip was iron, her fingers cool and dry despite the heat. Margaret's teeth clenched against a sound that wanted to tear its way out of her throat. She realized with a sick clarity that this was part of the lesson. Not only to endure the pain, but to do so in silence. Minutes passed, or seconds. Time collapsed in the burn, before her hands were released. She drew them out, the skin flushed and blistering in places, trembling as she tried to curl her fingers. The air against them was almost worse than the water, a cold bite against raw flesh. The abbess wrapped them in clean linen, winding the cloth with a precision that made it feel less like care and more like a binding. When she was done, she pressed her palm gently, Quinanan almost tenderly, to the top of Margaret's bowed head as though bestowing a blessing. "You have restless hands," she said softly, the first words spoken aloud in the room. "They will learn to be still." Then she was gone, the door closing behind her with the same quiet weight as before. Margaret sat for a long time, the throbbing in her hands pulsing up into her arms, settling deep in her chest. She realized that with her fingers bound and blistered, she could no longer write, could not record what she had seen, could not leave a mark anywhere that might outlast her voice if it were taken. The punishment had been chosen with precision. From her cot in the infirmary, she could hear the muted activity of the convent beyond, the shuffle of feet in the corridor, the dull thud of the kitchen door closing. But as night drew in, another sound began to bleed through. The slow, measured pacing of the abbess in the hallway outside. The rhythm was steady, unhurried, a sound that did not fade or grow closer, only continued as though marking time. Every so often she would pause, and in that pause Margaret felt the weight of an unseen gaze pressing against the door. The pacing lasted deep into the night. Even when it stopped, Margaret could not sleep. Her hands burned in waves, each throb a reminder that curiosity had a price here, and that price was always paid in something essential. By morning, the bandages were stiff with dried ointment, her skin beneath raw and tender. She was sent back to her duties, her every movement slowed by pain. The other sisters glanced at her hands but looked away quickly. Their eyes shuddered against the recognition of what they saw. She wondered how many of them bore their own injuries hidden under veils and sleeves, each one a quiet ledger of disobedience punished. Margaret understood now that the abbess's control was not only in the vows and the rituals, it was in the precision with which she chose her punishments. Each one crafted to strip away a specific means of resistance, leaving behind not just obedience but dependency. And here dependency was the truest silence of all. The day broke under a sky the color of wetted ash, and by noon the air held the charged stillness before a storm. Margaret's bandaged hands throbbed with each pulse, the linen stiff where ointment had dried, yet the ache no longer warned her. It pushed her toward action. Within these walls, grief carried no sound and fear became order. If help was to come, it had to be pulled from outside by a signal no rule could swallow. She chose fire because flame was the only voice the convent had not trained into obedience. In the elm court she found the maintenance shed with lamp oil and a bundle of dried kindling. Her wrapped fingers were clumsy as she arranged splits beneath a mat of leaves, wetting edges with oil so the burn would travel along the wall. She did not wish to destroy, only to breach, wide enough for town eyes to see smoke and come. The scraping beneath the chapel seemed to breathe through her, saying that waiting had become consent. She struck flint to steel until an ember caught. The flame moved in a patient crawl, tasting oil and finding dry veins. She watched long enough to be sure it would live, then stepped back into the cloister shade. A pale ribbon of smoke unraveled against the gray sky. Then it thickened, turned tar-dark, and climbed the wall. Wind pressed the column sideways across the dormitory windows. The bell marked the work hour, footsteps scattered. The sisters moved in lines drilled by years, order meant for floods now pressed into a shape for flame. Pails crossed the court in an ant trail, water hissing where it met the crawling edge. Margaret joined the line, passing empties, receiving full buckets she could barely lift, every grip a spark of pain. The shed coughed fire from its door seam, the thin roof blistered and curled. Mother Madeline entered without haste, veil unruffled, gaze sorting motion into service. No shouted orders, only a lifted hand that changed pace. The fire did not race, it advanced. Oil gave it paths but not wings, so it crept along bricks, up bark, into dry catches beneath eaves. Heat pressed air into lungs. Smoke wrote itself onto stone in strokes that would take weeks to fade. Margaret felt each breath scrape her throat like the sound under the chapel floor and match the abbess's rhythm. The lines held. The gate stayed closed. Beyond the wall, nothing moved. A sister fell near the dormitory door. Another sagged beside her. For a moment, buckets faltered. Margaret moved, but Mother Madeline was there first, sending novices to carry the fallen inside. The shed roof caved with a hollow gasp and flung sparks along the eaves. A thin rain began, the storm arriving out of patience. Steam rose where water met heat, and the flames, deprived, shrank to bright seams that refused to die. The rain saved what the buckets could not, but it blunted the signal. The smoke never towered high enough to betray them to the road. By late afternoon, the worst was beaten down. The shed was a black mouth, the court a map of warped lines. The elms wore vertical burns like tall, narrow mouths held open in mute protest. The two fallen sisters lay in the infirmary, breathing shallowly. Margaret stood in the corridor and felt the hollow thud of failure. She had made noise in the only language allowed, and still the world had not heard. At evening assembly, the abbess recast the day as a trial and a cleansing, a test separating what could withstand heat from what could not. There was no mention of the shed, no inquiry into cause, no question of how oil found a match. Vigilance was praised, humility commended, and they were sent to prayer with a gesture that behaved like blessing while performing dismissal. Night brought the smell of wet charcoal and the small sounds of repair. The chapel bell, warped in some seam too fine to see, gave an altered tone at compline, a flatness only an ear trained by silence would catch. Margaret kept it as a sign. The place had been touched, not broken. Its voice had changed and still spoke the abbess's language. In her cell, she lay with bandaged hands propped over her heart. Every throb counted a fact. No one would come unless the walls failed. Fire could not do it, not like this. She would have to find a rupture in the order, a seam the design had forgotten to watch. The smoke sting clung to her hair. When she closed her eyes, she saw elm scars like mouths that could not form a word. She thought of jars that spoke without breath, of the ledger with tidy marks, and felt a new thought. If light could not bring help in, perhaps it could show a path out. She turned the thought carefully, cupping it as one cup of coal in the wind. Sleep came skittish, but the thought stayed warm. By morning, the court would look wounded but whole, the wall like a wall again. The bell's new note would confess what had happened, and only to those who listened for what was missing. Margaret listened, and beneath the altered ring she heard the scrape again, as if the house were sharpening a blade and waiting for her to understand what must be cut next. The morning after the fire, the convent moved as if nothing had cracked, yet every surface carried a gray film that would not wash away. The elms in the court stood like wounded sentries, and the bell's new flat note turned prayers into proof that heat had left a flaw. Margaret woke with aching hands and one thought that would not let go. If smoke could not bring help in, escape would have to be carried outward by a body that refused to be counted. Order resumed, but attention had shifted. Mother Madeline walked the corridors with a softness that was his purpose, pausing at doorways as if measuring where to cut. In the afternoon, the abbess sent a novice with a folded slip that bore no words, only a number in a steady hand. 44. The number entered Margaret like a pin. At dusk, she was summoned to the scriptorium, a narrow room of registers that smelled of dust. On the table lay an open book, its header written in the abbess's neat script, the 44 Sorrows. Below, 43 names sat in order, each with a date and a margin mark, cross, spiral, or open circle. A blank line waited. Mother Madeline stood close behind, her calm heat filling the quiet. She spoke of devotion and completion, of a crown needing its final jewel, of the peace that follows when a design becomes whole. Her voice never lifted. Margaret understood as one understands a door that has swung shut. She would be the last sorrow, the perfected silence, the number that lets the page close. After that, attention followed her like a shadow she could not step out of. Duties shifted, so she spent more hours near the chapel and fewer in the garden, as if drawn toward a mouth that had decided to swallow. The scraping under the floor became regular, easy to clock against the bell. She counted doors and distances, memorized steps between breath and breath. She learned the hidden panel's latch would catch if pressed too fast, and that oil from a fingertip made the wood slide easier if left to rest. She learned the sound of the abbess's shoes and how long it took to fade. Her bandaged hands kept her from writing, so she built a map inside her chest, breaths to cross the cloister, heartbeats to unhook the panel, the sting of a candle stub as time. In the laundry, she counted cloth by fingertip, learning the size of a veil without seeing it, imagining fabric biting a railing if pulled into a rope. At night she walked the corridors in her head until the house seemed to move with her. The abbess began her visits, a hand resting on Margaret's shoulder, a heartbeat too long, a warm breath at her ear in the cloister, a fingertip tracing the base of the skull during blessing. Each touch was small and exact, an artisan's test mark before the true work begins. Fear here was not a tremor. It was a shape learned by muscle. One afternoon she was sent to the library to fetch a catechism from the highest shelf. In the shadow above the case sat a little wooden box, its dust thin, recently disturbed. Inside lay a coil of silver wire and 2 wedges of oiled wood. Tools for holding the mouth open and the tongue still, a finer set than the infirmary kept. She closed the box and climbed down without sound. That evening the abbess sent for her to help prepare the chapel. The lamps were low, the air cool and tight. As they worked, Mother Madeline spoke in a voice meant to sound like care. She said the hands were healing well, that the body learns the shape it is given when it surrenders its own. She praised the zeal that had lit the elm cord as a good spark in need of a better bell, saying, "True obedience turns fire inward." She lifted Margaret's chin with one finger, looked through her, then lowered it with the smallest smile. Margaret felt the shape of that smile land in her stomach like a small stone dropped in a well. Later, alone in her cell, Margaret thought of the blank line, of the wire and wedges, of the scraping that now sounded like a whetstone. She decided that if the last sorrow must be written, it would not be hers. The page would receive a name, but the hand that wrote it would shake. To do that, she would have to turn the house's design against itself, to make the order trip on its own perfect step. She would need the chapel, the hidden door, the hour when the bell's altered note masked other sounds, and at least one sister who still remembered how to move for herself. Her mind settled on a novice with a thin scar under the jaw and a look that had once carried more question than resignation. Tomorrow she would find her in the garden at the hour when the light fell flat and the watchers grew bored. The scraping rose again, close and sharp, as if the house were clearing its throat to say finish. Margaret matched her breath to that rhythm until fear slid into a cold calm. When the bell rang at dawn, its flattened tone promised nothing and warned everything. She stepped into the corridor with her head bowed and her eyes counting the way out with every beat the metal gave. The magistrate came 2 mornings after the bell's flat note settled into the convent like grit in a wound, arriving with 3 constables and a letter sealed in red wax. He was guided by a bundle smuggled in the orphanage breadbasket, pages tied in twine and marked with a small cross, a gift from invisibility to a world that still had a voice. Margaret watched the cart roll into mist. If the walls would not let sound out, paper would. The magistrate entered the cloister under Mother Madeline's measured smile, her veil immaculate, her hands open in welcome as if the visit were a courtesy call. He read the warrant. She bowed and promised full cooperation. Rooms were opened, cupboards unlatched, trunks lifted, drawers displayed. The chamber beneath the chapel, when found, was scrubbed blank. Table clean, straps removed, shelves bare, stone rinsed to a pale ghost of what Margaret had seen. Jars were absent, ledgers gone. The abbess said a rumor had troubled a fragile postulant. She feared hysteria and had cleared the area to prevent scandal. Her tone was equal parts sorrow and duty, the sound of a caretaker mending another's mistake. The constables searched anyway. They tapped walls and measured floors. They found only dust in careful order. The magistrate compared the bundle's drawings to the clean room and frowned, as if asked to weigh smoke. Mother Madeline offered tea. She spoke gently of charitable works, of widows fed, of girls taught to read prayers when the world had nothing but noise to give them. The magistrate's gaze moved to the sisters, who stood in 2 lines like still water. He asked simple questions to test the truth. Heads bowed, hands folded, throats worked without sound. Their silence played as piety, not fear. Margaret felt the moment slipping. Evidence had been washed, and the house wore innocence like a new coat. She understood then that the abbess's art was not knives or tonics. It was timing. She did not deny the chamber. She changed what it meant. The magistrate turned the pages again. Some drawings bore names and dates. He asked to see those women. Mother Madeline traced the list with a fingertip and replied that several had transferred to other houses, some to missions, some to heaven. She let the last word linger and crossed herself with a soft breath that almost sounded like grief. 2 constables visited the cemetery behind the elm court and found fresh earth raked smooth, no stones, only little wooden markers weathered blank. The abbess said humility forbade grand memorials. God knew his own. A constable brought up a box of wire and wedges from the library loft. The abbess glanced once and said they were dental tools donated by a physician who had since died. She produced a letter with a physician's name and a faded seal. The magistrate studied the paper, then the tools, then her face. The balance tipped toward doubt. Margaret's chance narrowed to a blade's width. She stepped forward, the bandages under her sleeves hot against the skin, and asked permission to speak. The request startled the room. Permission was granted. Her voice came rough but steady. She told of the scraping at night, the hidden latch, the jars labeled with names, the ledger of symbols, the taste of metal in the air. She did not accuse. She described. The magistrate listened. Mother Madeline did too, head slightly tilted as if hearing a bird that had flown in by mistake. When Margaret showed her burned hands, the abbess stepped nearer and answered first, calling the injury an accident from zeal during the fire, proof that Margaret was devout but impulsive. She reminded the magistrate that Margaret had sparked the blaze. The constable's notes confirmed there had indeed been a fire. Order, once invoked, stood with her. The magistrate asked to see the bell tower. The abbess agreed at once. Up the narrow steps they climbed into a room of ropes and dust. From there a low door led onto the roof. The storm had scoured the tiles. Beyond the wall the town lay mild and ordinary. Nothing on that height spoke of jars or ledgers. On the way down, the magistrate paused at a slit window that looked into the chapel and saw only clean stone. In the nave, Mother Madeline offered the bundle back to him. She said the drawings were the work of a frightened imagination and begged that they be sealed to protect reputations. He turned to Margaret for an answer. She held his gaze and said one sentence, "Search the well." The abbess's eyes did not change, but a breath in the room did. They went to the courtyard. The well wall was damp from recent rain. A bucket came up clear. The constable lowered a grapple. It struck something soft and then wood. They drew up a sodden sack, then another, then a third. Inside were scraps of cloth cut to veil shapes, lengths of leather with buckles and pages swollen with water. Ink bled into blue clouds. Lines still legible enough to show the tight hand Margaret knew. Mother Madeline looked at the ruin as if at a child's broken toy and said it proved nothing. She stood very close to the magistrate, close enough that her calm seemed to reach his sleeve. He ordered the grounds held and the sisters kept within, then retired to the rectory to draft a decision. By dusk he returned with words that pleased no one. The evidence was troubling but not sufficient for arrest. The chamber would be sealed pending further inquiry. The convent placed under observation. The abbess bowed as if accepting penance. Margaret felt the verdict like a door closing on light. Mother Madeline passed her in the aisle, the brush of her veil a cool whisper. In passing, she said, low enough for only one to hear, that completion always finds another path. That night the scraping resumed, measured as breath, as if the house itself were counting down. The constables hammered a board across the hidden door and sealed the nails with wax stamped by the city crest. They posted a watch at the gate and entered names in a ledger of their own, lines sharp and spare where the abbesses had been dense. Inside, the sisters were kept to the refectory while inventories were taken. Margaret sat among them and felt the oddness of numbers. 43 present, and one counted by a blank line that waited like an open mouth. She studied the abbess and saw no fear, only calculation, the stillness of a hand that knows a second blade lies wrapped in cloth. When the magistrate returned at sunset to deliver his ruling, the light through the high windows laid pale bars across the floor, a cage drawn by the sky. He warned that any change to the sealed chamber would mean immediate arrest. She thanked him for prudence and asked for a blessing for his journey. On the threshold he half turned, as if something had brushed his conscience, then walked out under the flattening bell. Margaret understood that a door had not closed, it had been left on the latch. She knew the night would test the seal, the watch, and her will again. Night came like a lid lowered, and the watch at the gate slid toward boredom as rainless clouds smothered the moon. Inside, the board across the hidden door held its wax seal, yet the scraping returned in a quicker rhythm, as if the house had decided to count for itself. The bell's flat note marked the hours with a dull blade. The sisters were kept in the refectory and cell while constables logged inventories that meant to pin the place to facts. Margaret waited for the hour she had measured when the wind turned east and the watch blinked longest. This would not be a call for rescue, it would be cauterizing. She had mapped the flues and hollow runs behind the wainscot, the pockets where lint and mouse nest gathered to a soft, dangerous weight. In the laundry, she lifted an oil can from a nail and a coil of linen twisted to rope. Her bandaged hands throbbed at each lift and steadied her with their pain. She moved when the bell tolled the hour before midnight, the sour note masking a blade tip easing a side latch. The sealed panel to the chamber stayed shut. She wanted it that way. The house had other mouths. She touched oil to the baseboards beneath the choir loft where dust lay deep as felt, tucked oiled wicks behind the altar rail, and fed tinder into the tower's throat where the rope wore a tarred splice thick as a thumb. Smoke gathered in corners, then the air bent with heat and the bell rope twitched as if a hand had tested it. A novice coughed and pressed her lips flat as training caught the reflex. Mother Madeline lifted her head, tasting the air, and turned toward the sealed door as the scraping rose like a chair drawn across stone. Wind pressed from the east and turned the tower into a chimney. Flame climbed the splice, a thin seam stitching upward into black, and the beam above it felt heat it had not known since it was planned. The bell began to warm, its voice rising unstruck, metal speaking in a thin keen that slid into bone. Margaret shouldered the roof door into wind that tasted of old rain. Below, the rooms woke red in rectangles and then smeared together. She toppled bucket stacks to stall the lines that had once saved the elm court, wedged a door that should have swung wide, and kicked the sand barrel until it slumped to paste. The sisters moved pails hand to hand with the grace of practiced obedience. Mother Madeline set their pace, intent and counting. For one still second their eyes met across smoke. Then the tower pulled and the rope flamed in a long, dark sigh. Margaret dropped to the outer passage where the wall met the orchard and felt for the weak mortar she had worried under a loose stone. It gave with a patient crumble. The block rocked once, twice, then slid enough to open a slit. She turned sideways and fed herself through, linen scraping, hands screaming, ribs against grit, and fell into cold weeds beyond the wall. Behind her, the house made a new sound, a slow inward breath that meant a beam had decided to kneel. Sparks lifted and drifted like a dull swarm. Neighbors on the road saw a single figure along the hedgerow with bandaged hands held close and a hood pulled low. Some said the figure limped. Some said it did not. No one called out. Within the walls the lines thinned, sand turned to paste, and doors wedged for order stuck to swollen frames. When the tower failed, it failed the way old things do, not in drama but in a letting go. The bell dropped and met a bed of heat and softened, its mouth folding until it spoke one wrong note too long and then none. The roof went after and the chapel breathed fire through its ribs. The seal over the hidden door blistered and ran. The board fell with a crack the wind did not carry far. By dawn there was no convent, only a low, smoking geometry and a heap where the tower had been. The constables raked with hooks and brought up fragments of bone that would not say from whom they came. No body lay whole enough to carry, no face remained to confront. In the elm court the trees stood black and tall like warnings. The magistrate arrived at noon and wrote the word accident because anything larger would have needed a voice the town did not have. Mother Madeline's room gave ash and a single warped spoon. The library yielded black bricks of books that could no longer be read. The sealed chamber proved itself a rumor in reverse: stone, water, and emptiness. Someone said the jars had burst and boiled their voices into steam. Someone said there had never been jars at all. People circled the ruins for a week, leaving small stacks of stones that meant nothing and everything, and then the wind took the smell and the road was forgotten. The ledger of names ended where it had ended before, at a blank line waiting like an open mouth. 44 was accounted for, and not. The rumor of the bandaged figure walked ahead of the smoke. In some attic, unseen yet, a sealed box settled deeper into dust. What remained inside the wall would not speak tonight, but it would in time, and when it did, the silence would bend. Decades later, a renovation crew in the orphanage attic found a cedar box wedged behind a fallen beam, its wax seal yellow and hard as glass. Inside lay papers wrapped in oilcloth, a palm-sized crucifix, 6 glass stoppers, and a narrow ledger bound in cracked leather. On the first page, in the same steady hand that once set prayers and punishments, a title ran like a rail: The 44 Names. Beneath it were 43 lines with dates and symbols, and then the blank Margaret had seen when hope still counted. A thinner booklet held drawings of throats and larynxes with notes about tinctures and ligatures, the strokes sure from repetition. A letter signed only by M praised discipline, warned that mercy must be firm, and hinted at a benefactor who liked results and never visited. The parish called the magistrate's grandson, now an attorney, who read in the attic while a former turned dust to slow snow. He said the state would convene a review and carried the box down the stairs like a sleeping child. In autumn, a historian, a surgeon, and 2 sisters from a reformed order met at City Hall to study what mold had spared. They spread the papers on felt and traced lines with cotton-gloved fingers under humming lamps. The surgeon said the diagrams were not curiosities but refinements. The historian translated French letters, thanking silence for doing the work law could not. The sisters touched each name with the back of a finger, as if greeting someone who had waited too long. That winter, the city set aside a plot near the old convent wall, where the elms kept their burn marks like tall, dark mouths. Stoneworkers raised 44 shallow niches in a curve facing the road. Brass plates carried names when names could be found. When they could not, a number and the ledger's symbol stood in their place: cross, spiral, open circle. People came with candles cupped in paper. Millwomen, dockmen, boys with caps too big. Widows who spoke to the plates like letters sent late. At the dedication, the attorney read an ordinance: inspections for enclosed orders, a registry for absolute vows, and a rule that any space of confinement must be mapped, filed and shown on request. The mayor signed, witnesses lined up, and each letter they wrote felt like a small refusal. The law did not punish the dead. It tied the living to knowledge so they could not pretend not to know. In the months after, carpenters found other hidden doors in other old houses, most empty, a few not, and each story flared and faded while the memorial stayed. School children learned to count the niches and to say why the spiral matters, why silence without consent is not peace. The ledger went to the university, its pages photographed and stored in a room that hummed with machines. Scholars argued about the letter M, Mother Madeline claiming authorship, Margaret sending a warning forward, or an unseen patron who paid for tinctures and helped the constable look away. But the arguments changed nothing about the weight of the names. In spring, a young nun came alone at dusk and read the list aloud, voice steady, breath frosting. At the blank line, she spoke a name not written anywhere and let it stand. Families with no sister to claim left small things in the niches: a straw ribbon, a cracked locket, a thimble, a square of blue cloth. The wind moved through and made a thin, decent music. Across town, the attorney framed the ordinance and hung it by his door because laws work best when ordinary eyes keep watch. The historian kept a copy of the spiral. The surgeon told new doctors what hands must never do in the name of order. A bronze plaque at the curve carries a plain sentence: evil does not always shout. Sometimes it updates the ledger. Visitors read it and look up at the sweep of names and understand that paperwork can be a weapon or a shield depending on who holds the pen. What remains of St. Dymphna's is a line of scorched earth under grass and a bell mouth folded into slag in a museum case. Children tap the glass and ask why a bell would melt, and the guide says heat changes even the faithful to another shape. In quiet hours, the niches seem to lean toward the road, listening for footsteps. Now and then a passerby hears the faintest rise of breath and calls it wind, but some do not. They say the memorial does not haunt, it reminds, which is a heavier task. Standing there, it is hard not to see how easily obedience wears kindness like a mask, how rules can be arranged so harm feels neat, and how silence can be trained until it sounds like virtue. The ledger ended once with a blank line. The city filled it with a law, a place, and a question left on purpose. What do you think? Could this happen again?